Welcome back to Behavioral Science for Brands, a podcast where we bridge the gap between academic research and practical marketing. Every week, we sit down and go deep behind the science that powers great marketing today. I'm Michael Aaron Flicker, and I'm wishing you a very happy holiday season. Today, I'm excited to bring you a special holiday throwback. As we wrap up the year, we wanted to reshare one of our audience favorites, episode 26 with Phil Agnew. And if you don't know Phil, he's the creator of Nudge, one of the world's most popular marketing science podcasts, and a master at breaking down the psychology behind why people say yes, why they remember certain brands, and why they act the way they do. It was an episode packed with actionable insights. And as we all enjoy some rest and relaxation over the holidays, it felt like a perfect moment to revisit Phil's thinking. Hoping you all have a wonderful holiday with friends and family. And now, here's our episode with Phil Agnew. Enjoy. Welcome back to Behavioral Science for Brands, a podcast where Richard and I go deep on behavioral science and really dig into topics that can help American marketers today. But before we get started, very excited to welcome Phil Agnew today, Senior Product Marketer at Buffer and creator, founder, and host of the Nudge podcast. Phil, welcome to the show.
Oh, thanks so much. I'm very excited to be here. I'm amazed by this studio. I love it. I'm not leaving.
We dressed it up for you.
Oh, just for me. Yeah, cheers. Thank you.
Yeah, and I thought for our listeners, let me give a little background to your podcast and how you approach it. If you don't mind me showering you with a little my analysis of your background. The Nudge podcast, dedicated to the intersection of consumer marketing and psychology, aims to explore how businesses can use insights from psychology to better understand and influence consumer behavior. 150 podcasts.
Yeah.
And counting.
Every
week?
Every week, yeah.
When I was researching all of your work, you had this quote recently that creating an emotional connection with audiences is crucial. People don't just buy products, they buy feelings. If you can make someone feel seen and understood, you've won half the battle.
Wow, did I say that?
You said that.
That sounds pretty good.
You're quoted.
I'll take it. Yeah.
It was inspiring to me. So welcome to the podcast. We're very excited to go deep with you on behavioral science today. But maybe you could start by giving us a little insight. How did you get into behavioral science? What was the thing that happened that brought you to behavioral science?
Yeah, well, that's a funny story because it's this guy sitting next to us.
I thought that might be.
Yeah, so Richard, you did a bit of work with a company where I worked at back in around 2018, 2017, at Brandwatch. And I'd never heard of the concept of behavioral science really prior to this. I'd done consumer psychology in my studies, and I'd vaguely knew of stuff like social proof. And then Richard came and did a few talks in the company, and then with our customers as well. You released your book in that year too, Choice Factory. I remember reading the Choice Factory and messaging my boss saying, I think we should buy a copy for everyone in the team. And he told me to shut up. It was like, what are you talking about? But I've been obsessed with behavioral science ever since. And yeah, I think back in 2019, thought I would really love to listen to a podcast about this concept and didn't really find one. So did that classic cliche marketing thing of thinking, I'll just do it myself. Interviewed you, Richard, plus some other researchers to get the podcast off the ground. And yeah, that was almost 5 years ago, 150 episodes later. Loving it. Really enjoy the field. Apply it regularly in my job. Apply it to the podcast I'm trying to grow, and spend way too much time reading research and popular science books on the concepts. But yeah, that's it.
And would you say that the way you look at marketing today has changed because of the deep dive you've done into behavioral science?
Definitely. I mean, it's quite funny. I was one of the ones who unfortunately spent 50 grand on my marketing degree. A lot of money. And I came out of it and I was asked to do stuff like write an email subject line that people will open. I had no idea what I was doing. I genuinely was like, okay, I'm going to use a SWOT analysis here, I think. I'm going to use some framework, and I just didn't know. And then started to learn more about behavioral science and consumer psychology, and you discover, wow, there are actually laws that people follow, maybe not laws, heuristics that people follow when they're making decisions. And if you understand those heuristics, you understand what causes people to open an email in the first place, and you can test and work on concepts that actually affect decisions. You put it really nicely. You have a quote, Richard, which is marketers are in the realm of decision making, right? And if you want to influence decisions, you've got to understand how people make decisions.
I think anyone who's walking down the street would think that we spent half our time discussing psychology and behavioral science as advertisers. I think it's slightly insane that there are thousands upon thousands of researchers out there doing all this work, trying to understand what actively and powerfully influences people, and that as an industry, we aren't using it as much as we should do.
Yeah.
We were talking as we were preparing to come out and do our podcast, how different behavioral science is applied in the United Kingdom and in the United States. In the UK, how would you all describe the application of behavioral science in marketing and advertising? This is something most agencies and brands know about, some, none. Where are we in penetrating the market?
I'm leaving that to you, Richard. What do you reckon?
I think it has definitely grown.
Yeah.
Back in the early 2000s, people would not know what you were talking about if you raised the subject of behavioral science. Now I think we've got to a situation where most marketers and most agencies have heard of this topic, but I don't think they are applying it as much as they should. So it's grown and it's become a mainstream topic, but I think there's still headroom.
Yeah. That would match your experiences as well.
I think people they've got the vocabulary now. If you say social proof, people know vaguely what that means, but they don't maybe understand some of the lateral ways you can apply that principle.
Yeah.
They think it's a quote on a website rather than all the wonderful different ways you could apply that sort of bias. And I think maybe that's where we're at. We're at a basic level. There's more to go.
And as the token American in the room, I will tell you that we're on that road. But in the United States, we're probably not as developed as the United Kingdom in terms of applying behavioral science in brands and in agencies' work.
Which is puzzling, I think, to many people, because the heartland of academic study is in America. Daniel Kahneman, Katie Milkman, Robert Cialdini, all based in America.
Yeah, it's really an opportunity for marketers and brands to say, we have academics that can guide the way we build our brands. We just have to go through it. We just have to learn it and apply it. It's an opportunity. When you were talking about lateral applications of social proof, that's always so interesting to me. Yeah. Maybe you could explain to the listeners a little bit what you mean by, not just putting a quote on a website, because I think that's always so helpful to talk about.
Yeah, I'll use examples. So social proof is the idea that we follow the actions of others. Evolutionary trait, as cavemen, if you see dozens of other cavemen running out of a cave,
you better run too.
You don't go in. Yeah. And we use it all the time. You go on holiday, you see people queuing outside a restaurant. You're going to go in that restaurant, or you're at least going to look at the Google reviews to see what the public opinion is. And there's this tendency in marketing just to think, oh, okay, if we just have a few quotes from our customers on our website, especially sort of SaaS, where you're buying online, direct to consumer stuff, that's enough. And there's so much more you can do. For example, there's been some studies recently in the last 2 years where if you put the amount of sales a product has next to the product, whilst you're actually on the product page, that can increase sales of that product. Say you're selling a coffee machine, it's got 390 sales. Just saying that 390 people have bought this coffee machine increased sales by, I think, 52% in one of the variants. And also, if you don't have enough sales, so you're a much smaller organization, if you just put the views, if you just say 3,000 people have viewed this product, that too has been proven to increase the actual sales by around 50%. And that's a huge increase.
Massive lift.
I can send the report, a bit of research, so we can include it in the show notes. But two very subtle ways, just little lateral ways of applying social proof to get people to actually make a decision and buy your product.
And the reason it works is because it implies the popularity, just the way that we teach social proof in a literal application.
Yeah.
It's just a lateral way to show that.
Yeah. You might have already talked about this, because I think this is one I've heard you talk about, Richard, but the e-cars in the UK with the number plates, just by putting the green number plate on there makes, because that's salient, and you see a green number plate more likely than you would a yellow or a white one.
Well, step back for us, because we don't know this in America.
Okay.
Yeah, please. So e-cars, it sells new and used cars?
No, as an electric car.
Electric cars.
Electric car.
Yeah.
Got it. Okay.
And the UK government has decided they have the choice, don't they, to put a green sticker or just a green bar to the left of the number plate in the car. And that's quite interesting because it's salient. People see this green number plate, which stands out from, in the UK, we just have white and yellow number plates. We don't vary by state. So
Interesting.
it really stands out. And in doing so, that's a lateral way of applying social proof, because if you see every 1 in 20 cars with this green sticker on it, that stands out, sticks in your mind, and you think, wow, lots of people own electric cars, makes people far more likely to buy them.
Very cool.
Yeah.
Jonah Berger has an amazing phrase in his book Contagious. He says one of the aims of a marketer should be to make private consumption public. So as Phil's saying, if you have the standard number plate and no one knows it's an electric car, once you start badging them and identifying in a very distinctive way, it feels like they're much popular, and that becomes, kickstarts a virtuous circle.
Very cool.
Yeah.
Very cool.
Now, we've started talking about some practical applications. You've talked about social proof, literally and laterally. What other brands do you think are applying behavioural science very well? What stands out in your mind as an exemplar?
Can I start with a bit of a cliche one? One that maybe you've talked about before, at least a lot of people think about, and this is Steve Jobs' time at Apple. I spent way too many evenings over a couple of months ago watching all of his keynotes at Apple with a behavioural science hat on, trying to figure out, is he applying behavioural science tips when marketing his products? It's a real direct way of just saying, okay, how is Steve Jobs actually selling? And it's fascinating to watch these keynotes with that hat on, because you see he is just using principle after principle to persuade people to buy these products and make these products more effective. So there's one that immediately hit me when I started watching these keynotes. Almost every time he would come on stage for a keynote, he wouldn't say, "Hi, my name's Steve Jobs. I'm CEO of Apple. Today we're doing this." He would say, "God, I'm so excited for today. We have spent months, weeks, years, weekends working to get this to you today. I can't wait to showcase it." And that, of course, is a bit of a labor illusion. Yeah. By showing people the amount of work you've put into something, you are far more likely to get people to buy it. So there's wonderful studies on this where if you give a prospective house buyer a list of houses and say, these have been handpicked for you by a real estate agent who has spent the evening trying to pick these houses, they will value those houses far, far more than if you give them the exact same list and say a computer generated these houses for you. And Steve Jobs is just using that same principle there, right? He's just showcasing the work he's put in.
That's fantastic. I didn't know he did that. So we have talked before around James Dyson using a very similar principle.
Yeah.
So the opening line of his autobiography, is about how he went through 5,126 prototypes, which failed before the 5,127th prototype was the complete success of this new radical bagless vacuum. Yeah. So again, that's something that one of Britain's most successful, illustrious entrepreneurs has naturally realised can boost appreciation of a product. Yeah. Excellent.
It's a really interesting one.
We talked about in Dyson as well that the design of the Dyson vacuum has so many see-through parts. You actually see it working as it sucks up and goes into the bagless component. So it's not only does he do it in the book, his autobiography, he does it in the advertising about the product, and then the product itself makes it more visible.
And even new products, for the hair dryers or hair curler type things, they talk about the amount of tests that each one go through. So it is a repeated tactic that Dyson use.
Yeah. It's a really good one. And it's not even the only one Steve Jobs uses. I mean, 10 seconds in, you're thinking, wow, okay, he's using a principle already. The one he absolutely loves, and this won't surprise either of you, is anchoring. Whenever he's trying to persuade someone, he tries to anchor them and give them a bit of extra information to make that offer or deal or promotion they're selling seem a bit more appealing. So the classic example is, rather than saying this iPod has 10 gigabytes of storage, he'll use an anchor which is far more salient and say it's 1,000 songs that can fit in your pocket. An example that I really loved was when he introduced the iPad. This was a fascinating keynote because prior to the iPad launching, there was loads of news articles about how this piece of kit would be worthless. You might remember this, right?
Yes.
We all thought, we've got laptops, we've got iPhones. Why on earth will we need an iPad? It just does the
It's
same
just a bigger
thing.
iPhone.
Exactly. And then people were commenting online, all of the journalists were saying, this is also going to be really expensive because it's like 3 times the size of an iPod. And they were saying, there's no way he's going to be able to justify this price for $600 or $500. It's just too much. One of them said it could even cost up to $999. And as soon as Steve Jobs read that, he thought, brilliant, I've got my anchor. So he starts to introduce the price of the iPad in this keynote. And he says, some of you in this room, because he's talking to the room of journalists, some of you have said this, points behind him, this will be the price. And $999, a bit of charm price in there as well, $999 appears in big writing behind him. He says, and that would make sense, that price, he says. There's so much tech in here, there's so much wonderful innovations, it should be that price.
Yeah.
And then he says, but it's not going to be that price. And I'm not kidding. The 999 smashes into a million pieces and 499 appears. And he says, this is the price we've got it down to. And the audience, which bear in mind is a bunch of people who said this will cost 600 quid and it's too much, erupts into applause because they think, oh, wow, I can't believe he's managed to do that. What an amazing price. And it's just because he set that anchor. If he says this will cost $499 and that's a really good deal, no, people would have exactly the same issues that they had before. They'll question that. But by setting an anchor, he made that price more appealing.
So he's using multiple different biases and insights from behavioural science.
Yep.
Was this something that you think he was interested in? Was he getting these findings from academic studies, or do you think he was just really attuned to human nature?
I think he was attuned to it because from a young age, he would apply these principles.
Yeah.
There's a great example. He created this product with Wozniak when he was in university.
Yes.
And it was called the Blue Box. And it essentially allowed you to make calls internationally without paying.
Yeah.
Totally illegal. Totally illegal. Shouldn't have been able to sell it. And he sold it in university dorms. And the way he sold it was he was leveraging some behavioral science. He would go into different dorm rooms where you've got a group of people sitting around. And rather than say, hey, folks, I'm Steve Jobs. I'd like to sell you this product. Here are all the benefits. He would say, hey, is Michael here? And they would say, no, what? And he would say, oh, Michael's looking to buy this Blue Box. I wanted to talk to him about buying the Blue Box. And they would say, oh, no, he's not here. But what is that? What's that Blue Box thing you're talking about? And then he would go into a sale pitch. Michael never existed. He made him up just so he had an in and to inspire a little bit of social proof, to suggest, oh, somebody else is interested in this product, a bit of scarcity maybe, somebody else wants to buy it, maybe I won't get the chance to. He's able to go in and sell it. And that was him at, I think, 16. So he was going for these radical, weird approaches that as a 16-year-old, I would never have thought of doing that. I would have just said, here are the product benefits. He was using them from the outset. And I think that's prior to reading any research.
Well, I think that flow often happens. Kahneman's research partner, Amos Tversky, said, all this stuff I've learned, used car salesmen and advertisers got there first. Now, he was being slightly self-deprecating, but there's definitely anyone who's interested in human nature, if they run a small business or they're attuned to what people do, I think they pick up on a lot of these principles.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of the hope for the podcast that we're making is it's not just CMOs of big companies that can use these principles. It's not just the largest brands, but everybody can find insight in these principles. And I think if you're using them at a car wash, if you're using them, in a smaller business, it gives you that confidence to know this is the types of things that I should repeat and that will yield me more results in the future.
And interesting to use the example of a car wash because it doesn't have to be multi-million-pound budgets that can access these ideas. You've mentioned the illusion of effort, Phil, and anchoring. Now, anyone can use those. There's no cost to applying them. So you might at least test them as concepts.
Absolutely.
Behavioral Science for Brands is brought to you by Function Growth, Ad Age's Newcomer Agency of the Year. Function Growth uses behavioral science to supercharge growth for direct-to-consumer brands. Delivering a wide spectrum of services, they are the one-stop shop for brands with high growth potential. Tired of agencies that make money when you don't? Function Growth's shared risk and reward model means they only make money when your brand grows. Discover how Function Growth can unlock the power of behavioral science to accelerate growth for your brand today.
So you talked about illusion of effort and anchoring, and the brilliant use by Steve Jobs.
Yeah.
Any other brands that you think have harnessed behavioural science quite powerfully?
Yeah, there's one I wanted to talk about today because they have harnessed behavioral science, but they've done it for the wrong reason.
Okay.
So I think it's an interesting one to talk about, and this is Theranos, which was Elizabeth Holmes's company. Now, Theranos was this company which was extremely successful at the time. So it made Elizabeth Holmes into the youngest self-made billionaire of all time. She was in the Forbes list, included everywhere. She became an icon, basically, because of this company she had created. This company was worth well over $1 billion itself. And the idea was that with just a pinprick of blood, a drop of blood, you could test your blood for all sorts of diseases, all sorts of illnesses. You don't have to go and get all of your blood taken, which is really stressful for people. You can use it on the military and on the field in military action. And there was all wonderful applications you could use this product. The only issue is the product didn't work. It never worked. They basically made it all up.
Quite a big issue.
Quite a big issue. And this all eventually came out. But the question I had when I was analysing her history is, why did people believe her for so long?
Yeah.
Why did people believe this bogus product? And a lot of it comes down to many different behavioral science principles she was using to make people trust her. So one is the halo effect. So she gained an awful lot of trust, of engagement, simply because she surrounded herself and she compared herself to people who were extremely successful. So she very early on got Henry Kissinger on the board, which obviously influenced people. She came from a family who was quite wealthy and well known and used that to her advantage. She would always start her pitches by talking about her granddad's success, for example, classic halo effect. But the most classic example is she completely styled herself, which is funny thinking about what we just talked about, on Steve Jobs. She wore the black turtleneck. She lowered the sound of her voice to even sound like him. And now all of that was to essentially make people think that she is similar to this other person who's extremely, successful. And the halo effect is fascinating. It works in such subtle ways. I read this one paper which suggested that if you're a designer store of some sort that's basically completely unknown, if you just put your store next to Gucci and Prada, your sales go up via just the association with them. That's, a little bit of halo effect. And I thought, I wonder if I could use this for my podcast. So I created two different images of my show. One which just showed the logo of my podcast, and one which showed the logo of my podcast, but very faintly behind it was all the other top shows in the UK. So Diary of a CEO, Desert Island Discs, whatever else it was at the time. And I showed it to about 200 people via a Google survey and just said, would you listen to this podcast? Yes or no? And some of them saw the one with just my logo. Some of them saw my logo, and very faintly in the background, they still knew they were being asked about Nudge, very faintly in the background, the other logos. And they were twice as likely. It went from 7% to 15%, twice as likely to want to listen to my show when it was associated with these other famous shows. And it's a great nudge to use. It obviously worked for Elizabeth Holmes by associating herself with these great people, but it can work for you as well. There is no shame in associating your brand or your podcast or whatever it might be with the other greats in the field. Just look back, if we go back to Steve Jobs, look at his Think Different campaign, which was just full of Einstein, Gandhi, all these great thinkers, and just associated them with Apple. And it was classic halo effect.
Yeah. So it brings up an interesting thing that Richard and I have spent a lot of time talking about, which is if you're going to be using behavioral science, there is some ethics that has to get applied. Yeah. There's when you're talking about changing people's belief, trying to change their behavior, you can, like Holmes did, you can use it to a negative effect.
Yeah. It's a tool. It's neither, behavioral science is neither good nor evil. It's just a neutral tool. I think people understand that when they talk about things like rhetoric. You can use rhetorical techniques to encourage people to love each other. You can use rhetorical techniques to encourage people to hate each other. It's not rhetoric's the problem, it's the ends that you use it to. Behavioural science is just the same. And as you say, Phil, unfortunately, it can be used to manipulate and mislead as much as to encourage people to do things they probably should do.
Yeah, and it creates a tension for all of us to not just teach the behavioral science, but to teach the ethics that ought to go along with it. When you're going to use these techniques, how can we make sure we use them for good or use them for positive? And I don't know that we should be policing one another, but it's helpful to call out if she was using these techniques. It would be interesting in the moment to say, look at these techniques she's using to gain momentum, for good or for bad. Be helpful to know that they're being used.
There's a great bit in Nudge by Thaler and Sunstein where they talk about the ethics of applying behavioral science, and they draw on the work of an American philosopher called John Rawls.
Yeah.
And I think they call it the publicity principle. And they say, if you're thinking about applying one of these biases, think to yourself, would I be embarrassed if my customer knew that I was applying it? And if the answer is yes, that should set off alarm bells.
Yeah, it's a great rule of thumb to follow.
So we've had Steve Jobs and Apple, Elizabeth Holmes and Theranos. Theranos. I love that as a name. It sounds like a Marvel villain.
Well, it's even Halo Effect. It is a Greek god, I believe, and it's a combination of two Greek gods. Anyway, they're using that exact principle there as well.
Okay, fantastic. Okay, what about one final example?
So the final example is a brand, so it's YouTube, but it's more about what the YouTube algorithm, and as such TikTok and other algorithms like it, but especially YouTube, how they have influenced the creation of media due to their algorithm, and I think encouraged almost everybody on the platform to use a very, 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 very effective behavioral science principle. And that principle is the curiosity gap. Now, this curiosity gap is very well known in literature, very well proven. If you give somebody all of the information about something, let's say they're walking into a movie and you say, here's all the things that happen in this movie, they'll be far less engaged to watch that movie.
Makes sense.
Whereas if you hold something back, they'll be way more likely to stay engaged. You might think this is clickbait and this is BuzzFeed and it's brand new. It's not. All of the most of the most successful writers in the world have used this. So Shakespeare's success actually came from a lot of the curiosity gap. His initial works were often recreations of works that already existed. However, back then, in the Hamlet play, for example, they would give all the information up front. They would say Hamlet is mad or he isn't mad, and they wouldn't leave anything to be discovered. Shakespeare's genius was hiding things from the audience, leaving them guessing and inspiring that curiosity gap. Charles Dickens did the same with a lot of his writing. He would publish them in daily or weekly newspapers and leave the final thing as a bit of a cliffhanger. That's a classic example. And anyway, people have known this for an awful long time, but they are starting to really understand this with YouTube. If you watch any YouTube video that is in any way successful, it starts with a bit of a curiosity gap. And I don't know how you two will start this podcast, but I would encourage you to maybe look at, say, Stephen Bartlett with Diary of the CEO, which is probably the #1 podcast in the UK. And he purposely starts that podcast by inspiring the curiosity gap. He will cut for the first 30 seconds to some of the most interesting, controversial things that the guest or host says, leave them unanswered, and it just inspires people to listen to an 1.5-hour episode. And that's enough. And just one final thing, I thought one of the things I love to do is to test these principles myself. And I thought, I'm going to test this on TikTok. I wanted to become TikTok famous. I'm not. But I did test it, and I had $2,000 of ad budget to spend. And what I did is I split it in half, and I created 20 different TikTok videos, all about behavioral science. So go to Nudge Podcast on TikTok if you want to watch them. But half of the videos started with a curiosity gap opener, and half of them didn't. So half of them started with a question, like Steve Jobs used these 3 incredible things to sell his products, and half of them just went into the topic. And I compared the two, and I can't remember the exact numbers, but the impact of the curiosity gap videos, it something like tripled the effectiveness in terms of the amount of views, in terms of the amount of engagement, but also because I had a link in my profile which measured how many people went and listened to the podcast, actually drove thousands more listeners to the show. Ultimately ended up allowing me to get about 11,000 followers, 500,000 views. And it all came down to using this curiosity gap intro, which is a behavioral science principle, which is obviously proven in the field, but it's known way back by the likes of Shakespeare, but still is fundamentally extremely important today.
I just love the fact you've run experiments to test it in a different area, and I think that's something that marketers should do far more of. We started by talking about Steve Jobs and the illusion of effort, and the Morales study on estate agents, and how the opinion of those realtors, we should say, changed according to the amount of effort that people thought they'd put in. Now, most brands are in a very different category than estate agents. So I always think they have a bit of a dilemma of, well, what should we do with this experiment if it isn't in exactly the same category or the same geographical areas we're using? And I think your spirit of, well, rather than reject the study, think of a approach that tests the underlying idea in a closer area is absolutely spot on. I think more people should do that to understand which biases work for them and which biases may be are better for a different context.
Yeah, and I think, there is literally no harm. What are you doing with marketing? You're going to be putting a message out there.
Absolutely.
Why would you not test it? Why would you not try something? Why would you not apply one of these principles? You are going to be messaging people anyway. It makes sense to be applying this stuff and learning from it and seeing what works. And you know what? The TikTok stuff, it was brilliant. It did clearly show me that the curiosity gap videos were more powerful. But ultimately, it also showed me that I wasn't very good at creating these videos. Even though it increased my engagement, it didn't lead to, millions of people listening to my podcast. So I thought, well, I'll try something else. So YouTube's been my recent one. But regardless, it still allows me to learn something that I can apply to other fields. And we're marketers. It doesn't have to be a peer-reviewed study. We don't have to. It doesn't have to be, completely foolproof. We just have to prove to ourselves that it works. And I think that's where it's really exciting, because you don't have all of the red tape that you'd have to go through if you were in academia. You can just try it yourself on a few hundred people, and it's cheap and it's effective.
I think it's a big takeaway for our listeners, because so often we hear we don't have the budgets to do testing, or we don't have, the creative costs and the media costs are too great. But it's about getting something into market just to see what the signals you get back. It's not as you say, a peer-reviewed academic article that needs to be published later. If we can learn from the signals of what we put into market, even small changes, it gives us a better base to work from as we make the next rounds and the next campaigns.
And if a brand has an e-commerce site, you've got essentially a laboratory. You can randomize visitors to that site into one of two cells, and then test a bias versus no use of a bias. And then very, very quickly, if you're a large enough brand, you'll know what works or not. That doesn't have to have any media cost attached to it.
That's right. And even if you are not tracking sales, which is sometimes the argument, well, I can't tell what led to more sales. We hear that from brands all the time. You can still see what got longer dwell time, what got more clicks, what drove more retention on the website after they clicked. There's lots of what we would call lagging indicators of of the work, even if it's not a direct A/B test.
Yeah, and it is just so easy. I mean, you mentioned an e-commerce site. I'd say if you send any emails, you've probably got access to a pool of people that most researchers would dream of. I interviewed Danny Zane, who's a researcher in the States, and he's done studies on special days. And he's found that on something like Star Wars Day or National Hot Dog Day or International Picnic Day, people are more likely to buy. And we did this interview. I was fascinated listening to it. And I thought, I'm just going to try this today. I looked up when International Podcast Day was. It was last week, 30th of September. So I sent my audience one of two emails. One said 50% discount to my course. Sign up today. The other said, celebrating International Podcast Day, celebrating here's 50% off. And it worked. The click-through rate on the International Podcast Day one was 2x. Yeah. And the open rate was, I think, 9% higher as well. And it was just like, that took me 5 minutes after learning about this insight to apply it. And I got a bunch of sales off the back of it.
That's fascinating. And I think if you look at it from the audience perspective, if someone says they're selling a product for 50% less, we often associate low cost with low quality, so it sets off alarm bells. But if you attribute the reduction in price to the
celebration,
suddenly I think you might maybe you avoid that quality price trade-offs. That's a lovely thing that people can go out and apply very quickly.
It's a really good one, because we all hate, even as marketers, we hate getting cold calls, we hate seeing ads, we hate getting interrupted, we hate getting junk mail. But if you attach it to a special day, it feels like there is justification for that communication. Suddenly it goes from being, why am I getting this unsolicited LinkedIn DM, to being, oh, it's International Star Wars Day. Yeah, maybe I will watch Star Wars tonight.
Yeah.
Or, you know, oh yeah, maybe I will get Disney Plus and watch the latest TV show at them on, because there is justification for it. So we've covered a lot of nudges today, but one more just to chuck in at the end, the special days. Yeah.
Brilliant. Who was the academic? Did you say Zane?
Daniel Zane.
Daniel Zane.
So we've covered a lot of ground today, and we always like to wrap it up if we can. Who wants to take a swing at the big takeaways that we covered today?
So, okay, we've covered 3 different topics. We had, Steve Jobs to begin with.
Yes.
How he was a person deeply attuned to human nature and used biases like the illusion of effort. So this idea that if you tell people how much effort you've gone to, it makes the product feel higher quality. You mentioned his use of anchoring.
Yeah.
So we don't just appreciate the value of a product by looking at its inherent qualities. You throw out a random irrelevant number and that will affect people's valuation. So his classic use, you mentioned the beginning, was suggesting it might cost $999 as an iPad, and then revealing it was $500 cheaper. So that was fantastic. We had Steve Jobs. Then we talked about Elizabeth Home, who worked for what brand? Theranos. Not Theranos. Theranos. And what some people call sludge, the negative, unethical use of behavioural biases. I think that's a fascinating area. Behavioural science doesn't give you the right to manipulate people. You've got to be very careful about applying these biases in a positive manner. And then the final example was, I think, a brilliant one around YouTube and the idea that often sometimes called the Zeigarnik effect. If you leave a cliffhanger, if you leave a little bit of uncertainty, that creates an itch that the listener has to scratch. So I think 3 really interesting big principles that can be applied by lots of different brands.
We always like to end with a question. Something you're reading today that is exciting, something you're reading today that's really interesting. Give our listeners something to add to their reading list.
I'm reading Mary Beard's book on the Roman Empire, and I'm really struggling with it at the moment, so I'm not going to recommend that. I read your book recently, Richard, and it's incredible. If anybody listening has not read Richard's latest book, then pick that up. I also read, we mentioned Jonah Berger earlier, and his book Contagion. He's written a new book called Magic Words, and it is about the subtle changes in words, even sometimes just a letter difference, like changing the word vote to voter when asking people to vote, and how that can have an incredible impact on the amount of people voting. Spoiler alert, 10% swing in terms of the amount of people voting. It changed Obama's election campaign in 2008, just from this one study by a researcher called Christopher Bryan. So very, very interesting book. I would recommend picking that up if you create any sort of messaging and want to change people's decisions.
Amazing. Well, thanks so much for being here today. And for everybody listening and watching at home, feel free to write in questions, rate the show. And until next time, thanks so much for being with us.
Thanks very much for having me. Cheers.
Cheers.
Behavioral Science for Brands is brought to you by Method One. Recognized as one of the fastest growing companies in America for the 3rd year in a row, featured on Inc.'s 5,000 list. Method One is a proudly independent creative and media agency grounded in behavioral science. They exist to make brands irresistible, helping people discover products, services, and experiences that bring moments of joy to their lives. As behavior change experts, Method One creates emotional connections that drive true brand value for their clients, focusing primarily with indulgence brands in the CPG space. Find out more at methodone.com.